The dust storm had been raging for 3 days when Eleanor Whitmore realized she had nothing left to eat except a half sack of flour and 2 wrinkled potatoes that had sprouted eyes in the darkness of her cellar. The year was 1876, and the Arizona Territory was unforgiving to those who thought they could carve out a life from its harsh landscape. Eleanor had come west with her husband Thomas 2 years prior, filled with dreams of prosperity and freedom, but those dreams had died along with him 6 months ago when his horse had stumbled into a prairie dog hole and thrown him headfirst into a boulder. She had buried him herself behind the small house they had built together, her hands blistering around the shovel handle as she dug through the hard-packed earth under the merciless sun. Now she stood at the window of that same house, watching the red dust swirl across her small property, obscuring the mountains in the distance. Her chickens had stopped laying weeks ago from stress and poor feed. Her vegetable garden had withered despite her careful rationing of water from the well. The nearest town, Copper Springs, was 8 miles away, and she had exactly $3.17 to her name. Pride was a peculiar thing, Eleanor thought as her stomach cramped with hunger. It could keep a person's spine straight even when everything else was falling apart. She had seen the way the townspeople looked at her during her last visit to Copper Springs, their eyes filled with pity and speculation. The widows who had remarried quickly, the shopkeepers who extended credit they knew would never be repaid, the men who made offers that had nothing to do with honest work. She would rather starve than accept charity that came with strings attached, and she would certainly rather starve than beg. She had been raised by a father who believed that self-reliance was the highest virtue, that asking for help was admitting defeat. Even now, with her ribs beginning to show through her worn calico dress, she could hear his voice in her head, stern and unyielding. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 12, and her father had raised her like he might have raised a son, teaching her to shoot, to ride, to keep her own counsel. When she had married Thomas against his wishes, wanting to forge her own path westward, her father had told her she had made her bed and would have to lie in it. He had died the winter after she left Missouri, and she had not been there to say goodbye. The knock on her door 3 days after the dust storm ended was so soft she almost missed it. When she opened the door, there was no one there, just the empty expanse of scrubland stretching toward the distant town. But on her doorstep sat a burlap sack, and when she knelt to open it, her hands trembling, she found salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, and a small bundle of vegetables that must have cost a fortune given the season. Eleanor looked around wildly, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, but saw nothing except a hawk circling lazily overhead. Her first instinct was to leave the supplies where they sat, to close the door and pretend they had never appeared. But her stomach betrayed her, growling loudly, and her practical nature warred with her pride. Whoever had left this had already gone. There was no one to thank, no debt to acknowledge, no obligation to accept. Slowly, she picked up the sack and brought it inside. That night she made the first proper meal she had eaten in weeks, frying salt pork in her cast-iron skillet and making cornbread from the meal. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to think about who might have left the supplies or why. Perhaps it was one of the other homesteaders from miles away, someone who understood the code of the frontier that said neighbors helped neighbors without making a fuss about it. Perhaps it was someone from town who had known Thomas. She did not let herself consider that it might be someone who expected something in return. 5 days later, it happened again. This time the knock was a little louder, and when Eleanor rushed to the door, pulling it open quickly, she caught a glimpse of a man on horseback riding away at a steady pace. He did not look back, and the distance was too great for her to make out more than his general shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the typical clothing of a working cowhand. On her doorstep was another sack, this one containing flour, sugar, lard, and a bag of oats that she suspected was meant for her horse, an aging mare named Rosie who had been slowly starving along with her. Eleanor stood in the doorway holding the sack, her emotions a confused tangle of gratitude, shame, and anger. She did not want to be anyone's charity case, did not want to be the poor widow woman who could not take care of herself. But she also could not deny that, without these supplies, she would have been forced to make impossible choices. Sell Rosie for slaughter money, give up the homestead and move into town to take whatever work she could find, or worse. She made a decision then, standing in the doorway with the morning sun warming her face. She would accept the supplies because she needed them to survive, but she would find out who was leaving them, and she would repay every cent once she got back on her feet. It was not charity if it was a loan, even if the lender did not know he was being repaid. Her father might have called this rationalization, but her father had never been a widow alone in the Arizona territory with no family and no resources. The next time supplies appeared, Eleanor was ready. She had been watching from the window for 2 days, sleeping in brief snatches, determined to catch her mysterious benefactor in the act. When she saw the dust cloud that signaled an approaching rider in the pre-dawn darkness, she moved to the side of the window where she could observe without being seen. The man who rode up to her door was younger than she had expected, probably close to her own age of 24. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on the ground, and even in the dim light, she could see that he was handsome in a weathered, sun-darkened way. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat pulled low over his face, and he moved with quiet efficiency as he dismounted, placed a sack on her doorstep, knocked softly, and swung back into the saddle. Eleanor made her decision in an instant. She threw open the door and called out, "Wait!" The man froze, his horse dancing sideways at the sudden noise. For a moment Eleanor thought he would simply ride away, but then he slowly turned the horse to face her. In the growing light, she could see his face more clearly, strong jaw, dark eyes that seemed wary, a mouth set in a serious line. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was part greeting, part question. "I want to know who you are," Eleanor said, stepping out onto the porch but keeping her distance. She was aware that she was alone, that she knew nothing about this man except that he had been kind to her, and that kindness itself could sometimes be a mask for darker intentions. "Name is James Cartwright, ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough like he did not use it often. "I work at the Double Bar Ranch about 12 miles north of here." "Why have you been leaving supplies at my door, Mr. Cartwright?" Eleanor kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "I do not recall asking for charity." Something flickered in his eyes, though whether it was amusement or irritation she could not tell. "Did not figure you for the asking type, Mrs. Whitmore. That is why I left them quiet-like, so you would not have to ask. And what exactly do you expect in return for your generosity?" Eleanor heard the edge in her own voice and did not try to soften it. She had learned that men rarely gave something for nothing, especially to women alone. James Cartwright looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. Finally, he said, "Not expecting anything, ma'am. Knew your husband a bit. He helped me once when my horse threw a shoe and I was stranded halfway between town and the ranch. He did not have to stop, but he did. Shared his water and his tools and would not take payment for either. Figured I owed him." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "Thomas helped a lot of people," she said quietly. "He believed in being neighborly." "Yes, ma'am, so do I." James gathered his reins as if preparing to leave, then paused. "I know you do not want charity, Mrs. Whitmore, and I respect that. But the way I see it, your husband did me a kindness and I am just passing it along. No debt, no expectations, just one neighbor helping another." "I will pay you back," Eleanor said firmly. "I do not know when or how, but I will." James Cartwright shook his head slowly. "No need for that, ma'am. Like I said, the debt was to your husband, and it is paid as far as I am concerned." He touched his hat again and began to turn his horse. "Mr. Cartwright," Eleanor called, and he paused again. "Thank you, for the supplies and for your discretion." It means more than you know. He nodded once, and she thought she saw the ghost of a smile cross his face before he rode away into the rising sun. Eleanor stood on her porch for a long time after he disappeared from sight, holding the sack of supplies and thinking about pride and survival, and the strange ways that kindness could manifest in a harsh world. James Cartwright had given her a gift more valuable than the food itself. He had allowed her to keep her dignity. He had not made her beg, had not made her feel small or helpless or dependent. He had simply seen a need and filled it, as quietly and unobtrusively as possible. Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself thinking about James Cartwright more often than she wanted to admit. The supplies did not appear again at her doorstep, and she told herself she was relieved rather than disappointed. She used what he had given her carefully, stretching each meal as far as it would go, and slowly her chickens began to lay again as she was able to feed them properly. She planted a new garden, hauling water from the well in the cool of early morning and late evening, and the seeds began to sprout in neat green rows. She also began making the trip into Copper Springs more regularly, looking for work that she could do to earn money. The town was small but growing, fed by the copper mines that had given it its name and the cattle ranches that sprawled across the surrounding territory. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, and a scattering of other businesses that served the miners and cowboys who came through. Eleanor had some skill with a needle, learned from her mother before she died, and she managed to find work doing mending and alterations for the dry goods store. The pay was minimal, just a few cents per garment, but it was honest work and she could do most of it at home. She also took in laundry from some of the miners who had no wives to do it for them, which was back-breaking work but paid better. Her hands, which had been soft when she first came west, became rough and reddened, her nails broken and her fingers perpetually wrinkled from time in the wash water. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the general store one afternoon in early July when she saw James Cartwright again. He was standing outside the saloon across the street, talking with 2 other cowboys, and the sight of him made her heart do something strange in her chest. In the full light of day, she could see him more clearly than she had in the dawn darkness. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck and sun-weathered skin that spoke of long days working outdoors. He moved with a kind of unconscious confidence, comfortable in his own skin in a way that Eleanor envied. As if sensing her gaze, James looked up and their eyes met across the dusty street. Eleanor felt her face heat with embarrassment at being caught staring, but she forced herself to nod in acknowledgement. James touched his hat to her, that same small gesture she remembered from their brief conversation, and she thought she saw a smile tug at the corner of his mouth before one of his companions said something and drew his attention away. Eleanor turned back to her laundry with more force than necessary, snapping the wet fabric and pinning it firmly to the line. She told herself that the flutter in her stomach was just hunger, that the warmth in her face was just the heat of the July sun, that she had no business noticing how a man looked or moved when her husband had been dead less than a year. Thomas had been a good man, a kind man, and she had loved him in the comfortable way of 2 people who had grown up in the same town and always known they would marry. He had been her friend before he was her husband, and she missed him with a dull, persistent ache that never quite went away. But Thomas was gone, and she was still here, still alive, still young despite feeling ancient some days. And James Cartwright had been kind to her when he did not have to be, had seen her need without making her feel ashamed of it, and that meant something even if she was not sure what. She finished hanging the laundry and went into the general store to collect her pay for the mending she had completed. The owner, a thin, sour-faced man named Mr. Hutchins, counted out her coins with obvious reluctance, as if each penny pained him to part with. Eleanor took the money without comment and was turning to leave when a voice behind her said, "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore." She turned to find James Cartwright standing just inside the door, his hat in his hands. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not just dark but a deep brown flecked with gold, and that he had a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He smelled like horse and leather and sunshine, and Eleanor took a small step backward, suddenly aware of how she must look in her faded dress with her hair sticking to her sweaty forehead. "Mr. Cartwright," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady. "What brings you to town?" "Supply run for the ranch," he said, gesturing to the list in his hand. "Saw you across the street and wanted to say hello, see how you are getting along." "I am managing," Eleanor said, lifting her chin slightly. "I have found some work in town enough to get by." "That is good," James said, and he sounded like he meant it. "The laundry and mending," Eleanor nodded, wondering how he knew and then realizing that in a town this small, everyone knew everyone else's business. "It is honest work." "Never said it was not," James replied. "Takes strength to do what you are doing, Mrs. Whitmore. Not many women would have stuck it out alone on a homestead. Most would have given up and moved back east." "I have nothing to go back to," Eleanor said, more honestly than she had intended. "My father is dead, I have no siblings, and Thomas and I used everything we had to file the claim on the land. This is my home now, for better or worse." James studied her with those dark, gold-flecked eyes, and Eleanor had the unsettling feeling that he saw more than she wanted to reveal. "Well," he said finally, "if you ever need anything, Mrs. Whitmore, or if there is work around your place that needs doing, I hope you will let me know. I am handy with repairs and such, and I owe your husband more than a few sacks of supplies." Eleanor felt that familiar prickle of pride, the instinct to refuse, to insist she could handle everything herself. But she was learning, slowly and painfully, that survival sometimes meant accepting help, even when it chafed. "Thank you, Mr. Cartwright," she said. "I will keep that in mind." He nodded and stepped aside to let her pass, and Eleanor walked out into the bright afternoon sunshine with her meager wages clutched in her hand, and a strange warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Over the next few months, Eleanor saw James Cartwright regularly in town, and each time they exchanged polite greetings that gradually grew into brief conversations. She learned that he was from Texas originally, that he had come to Arizona 5 years ago looking for work and had hired on at the Double Bar Ranch, that he had saved enough money to buy a small piece of land where he hoped to start his own herd someday. He was 26 years old, had 2 younger sisters back in Texas who wrote him letters he carried in his saddlebag, and preferred coffee to whiskey, which set him apart from most of the other cowboys. For his part, James learned that Eleanor could shoot better than most men, that she had a dry sense of humor that emerged when she felt comfortable, that she missed reading books more than almost anything else from her old life, and that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide when it came to accepting help. He found himself looking for excuses to be in town on the days when he knew she would be there, found himself watching for her slender figure moving among the other townspeople, found himself thinking about her at odd moments when he should have been concentrating on his work. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that felt significant in a way James could not quite name. He had known other women, had even courted a girl back in Texas before he left, but none of them had intrigued him the way Eleanor Whitmore did. There was a strength in her, a resilience that had nothing to do with physical toughness and everything to do with the spirit that kept her going when most people would have given up. She did not want to be rescued, did not want to be taken care of, and James respected that even as he wanted to make her life easier. In late September, a storm rolled across the territory with a fury that seemed determined to tear everything apart. Eleanor had been watching the sky darken all afternoon, had seen the way the animals grew restless and skittish, had felt the charge in the air that presaged violence. She brought Rosie into the small lean-to that served as a barn, secured the chickens in their coop, and retreated into the house to wait it out. The storm hit just after sunset with a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to split the sky. Rain came down in sheets, driven nearly horizontal by winds that howled around the corners of the house and rattled the shutters. Eleanor lit a lamp and tried to read one of the 3 books she owned, but the storm was too loud and too frightening to concentrate. She had weathered storms before, but this one felt different, more violent, and she could not shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. She was proven right just before midnight, when a particularly strong gust of wind tore part of the roof off the lean-to with a scream of rending wood. Eleanor heard Rosie's panicked whinny and was out the door in seconds, not bothering with a coat or hat, just running through the driving rain toward the sound of her horse's distress. The lean-to was half-collapsed, and Rosie was trapped under a fallen beam, her eyes rolling white with terror. Eleanor tried to lift the beam, but it was too heavy and too awkward, pinning the horse's hindquarters. Rosie thrashed and struggled, making the situation worse, and Eleanor was crying now, tears mixing with rain on her face as she tried desperately to free her horse. She needed help, needed another set of hands, but she was alone in the darkness with the storm raging around her and no one to hear her, even if she called. And then, like an apparition conjured from her desperation, James Cartwright appeared out of the rain, leading his own horse and shouting something she could not hear over the wind. He tied his horse quickly and moved to her side, assessing the situation in seconds. Together they managed to lift the beam enough for Rosie to scramble free, limping but alive, and James grabbed the mare's halter and led her toward Eleanor's house while Eleanor followed, stumbling with exhaustion and relief. They got both horses into the house itself, there being nowhere else safe to put them, and James shut the door against the storm. They stood dripping on Eleanor's floor, breathing hard, and looked at each other in the lamplight. James's hat was gone, his dark hair plastered to his head, and there was a cut on his cheek where something had struck him. Eleanor knew she looked no better, her dress soaked through and her hair hanging in wet ropes down her back. "What were you doing out in this?" Eleanor asked when she could catch her breath. "Saw the storm coming and knew it was going to be bad," James said, water dripping from his clothes onto the floor. "Thought you might need help. Looks like I was right." Eleanor wanted to protest, to say she had been managing just fine, but the words died in her throat because they both knew she had not been fine. Without James's help, Rosie might have died trapped under that beam, or Eleanor might have been hurt trying to free her alone. Instead, she said, "Thank you, again." James smiled, a real smile that lit up his whole face and made him look younger. "You are welcome. Again." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, some barrier that had been keeping them at a polite distance beginning to crumble. She was suddenly, intensely aware that they were alone together in her house in the middle of the night, both soaked to the skin, and that this was precisely the kind of situation that could ruin a woman's reputation if anyone found out. She should ask him to leave, storm or no storm, should preserve the propriety that was all she had left besides her land. But instead she said, "You are bleeding. Let me tend that cut." She got a clean cloth and a basin of water, and James sat at her small table while she carefully cleaned the cut on his cheek. He sat very still, watching her face as she worked, and Eleanor tried not to notice how close they were, how she could see the individual drops of water caught in his eyelashes, how his breath stirred the damp tendrils of hair that hung by her face. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she told herself it was just from the cold and the adrenaline of the last hour. "Eleanor," James said softly, and it was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his low, rough voice made something flutter in her stomach. "I need to tell you something." Eleanor paused in her ministrations, the cloth still pressed to his cheek. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about you," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "More than I should, probably, more than is proper given that you are still in mourning. But I cannot seem to help it. You are the strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I find myself looking for reasons to see you, to talk to you, to be near you." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "James, I do not know what to say." Thomas has only been gone 8 months. I should not be thinking about another man. I should not be feeling what I am feeling. And what are you feeling? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor took a shaky breath. Alive, she admitted. For the first time since Thomas died, I feel alive when I am around you. And that terrifies me because I feel like I am betraying his memory, like I am being disloyal to the vows I made. James reached up and gently took her hand, the one still holding the cloth to his face. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. Thomas was a good man, and I know you loved him, but he is gone, Eleanor, and you are still here. Being alive is not a betrayal. Being happy is not disloyal. I think if he cared about you the way you say he did, he would want you to live, really live, not just survive. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the sheer relief of having someone say out loud what she had been afraid to think. I do not know if I am ready, she whispered. Then I will wait, James said simply. I will wait as long as it takes because you are worth waiting for. The storm raged outside until dawn, and James sat in Eleanor's rocking chair wrapped in a quilt while she lay in her bed on the other side of the room, both of them awake and aware of the other's presence. The horses dozed standing up, Rosie favoring her bruised leg but otherwise unharmed. When the first light of morning came through the windows, the storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean and sparkling. James saddled his horse and prepared to leave, and Eleanor walked him to the door. They did not touch, did not even stand particularly close, but there was a new understanding between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been spoken aloud and could not be taken back. I meant what I said last night, James told her as he swung into the saddle. All of it. I will wait as long as you need, and if you decide you do not feel the same way I do, I will respect that too. But I hope you will at least think about it. I will think about it, Eleanor promised, and watched him ride away across the muddy landscape toward the double-bar ranch. She did think about it, obsessively, turning it over and over in her mind as she worked. She thought about it while she scrubbed clothes in her wash tub, while she mended torn pants and sewed on buttons, while she tended her recovering garden and fed her chickens. She thought about James's hands, rough but gentle, and his eyes that seemed to see straight through to her core, and the way he had ridden through a dangerous storm because he thought she might need help. She also thought about Thomas, about their brief marriage and their plans that would never come to fruition. She had loved Thomas, but if she was honest with herself, it had been a comfortable love based on familiarity and shared history. What she felt when she was around James was different, more intense, almost frightening in its strength. With Thomas, she had felt safe and settled. With James, she felt challenged and awakened, like a part of her that had been sleeping was suddenly wide awake and demanding attention. A month passed, and then another. Eleanor continued her work in town, slowly saving her meager wages. James continued to appear regularly, never pushing, never demanding, just being present. He fixed her chicken coop when a coyote tried to break in, replaced the roof on her lean-to with sturdy new wood, and helped her harvest what vegetables her garden had produced. He never asked for payment and he never mentioned what he had said that stormy night, but his feelings were clear in every gesture, every look, every moment of consideration. In November, Eleanor made her decision. She put on her best dress, the dark blue one she had been married in, and rode Rosie the 8 miles into Copper Springs. She found James at the livery stable, helping the blacksmith shoe a difficult horse, and she stood in the doorway watching him work until he noticed her. When he did, his face lit up with a smile that made her feel warm all the way through. "Eleanor," he said, handing the horse off to the blacksmith and walking toward her, "is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," she said. "I wanted to talk to you if you have time." They walked together to the edge of town where there was a small grove of cottonwood trees by a dry creek bed. The leaves had turned golden and were falling in the November wind, drifting down around them like blessings. Eleanor turned to face James, her heart pounding but her decision made. "I have been thinking about what you said," she told him. About being alive, about being happy, and I have realized that you were right. Thomas would not have wanted me to spend the rest of my life mourning him. He would have wanted me to be happy, to live fully, to love again if I found someone worth loving. James stood very still, barely breathing, waiting for her to continue. I am not good at this, Eleanor said with a self-deprecating smile. I am not good at being vulnerable or asking for what I want or admitting that I need anyone. But I need you, James. I need your kindness and your strength and the way you see me as strong instead of as someone to be pitied. And more than that, I want you. I want to know what it is like to be with someone who makes me feel the way you make me feel, like I am more than I thought I was, like I am capable of more than just surviving. James closed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. Eleanor Whitmore, I have been half in love with you since the first time I saw you standing on your porch with your chin up and your eyes fierce, too proud to beg even though you were starving. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy if you will let me. Yes, Eleanor breathed, and then he was kissing her, soft at first and then deeper, and Eleanor felt like she was falling and flying all at once. She had been kissed before by Thomas, but this was different. This was fire and need and something wild that she had never known. She was capable of feeling. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and loneliness and hope that she had been carrying, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she felt tears on her cheeks, though she was not sad at all. Marry me, James said, still holding her face in his hands. I know it is fast, I know people will talk, but I do not care. Marry me and let me take care of you, not because you cannot take care of yourself, but because you should not have to do it alone anymore. Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy. People will definitely talk. The widow Whitmore, remarrying less than a year after her husband died, the scandal will keep Copper Springs entertained for months. Let them talk, James said fiercely. Let them say whatever they want. I know the truth, which is that you are the bravest, most resilient woman I have ever met, and I am the luckiest man alive that you are giving me a chance. Then yes, Eleanor said. Yes, I will marry you, James Cartwright, and we will face whatever comes together. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Copper Springs. The minister, an elderly man named Reverend Pierce who had known Thomas, looked vaguely disapproving but performed the ceremony without comment. Eleanor wore the same blue dress she had worn to talk to James, and James wore his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven. There were only a handful of witnesses. The ranch foreman from the double bar who served as James's best man, the woman who owned the boarding house where Eleanor sometimes delivered laundry, and a few curious townspeople who had heard about the wedding and wanted to see the scandalous widow remarry. Eleanor did not care what they thought. As she stood beside James and spoke her vows, promising to love and honor him for as long as they both lived, she felt a peace settle over her that she had not felt in a very long time. This was right, she knew in her bones. This man, this moment, this choice. After the ceremony, James took her back to his small cabin on the land he had bought, about 15 miles from her homestead. It was modest, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was sturdy and well-built, and Eleanor could see the care he had put into every detail. There was a cast iron stove for cooking, a real bed with a quilt his sisters had made for him, shelves he had built himself, and a rocking chair positioned by the window to catch the afternoon light. I know it is not much, James said, watching her take in her new home. But it is ours, and we can make it into whatever we want it to be. It is perfect, Eleanor said, and meant it. She had lived in grander houses back in Missouri, but this cabin represented something those houses never had, a future built on choice and love rather than obligation and expectation. That night, lying in James's arms in the bed they now shared, Eleanor felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. Thomas had been a good husband, careful and considerate, but James was something else entirely. He was passionate and intense, and he made her feel things she had only read about in novels, made her understand why poets wrote about love as if it were a force of nature. "Are you happy?" James asked, his voice rumbling in his chest under her ear. "Happier than I ever thought I would be again," Eleanor said honestly. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over in all the ways that mattered. I thought I would spend the rest of my years just going through the motions, surviving but not really living. You showed me I was wrong." James tightened his arms around her. "We are going to have a good life together, Eleanor. I promise you that. It might not be easy, and we will probably have our share of hard times, but we will face them together." "Together," Eleanor repeated, liking the sound of the word. She had been alone for so long, even when Thomas was alive in some ways, because she had always felt like she had to be strong and capable and self-sufficient. With James, she was learning that strength could include vulnerability, that being capable did not mean never asking for help, that self-sufficiency was less important than partnership. Over the winter months, Eleanor and James settled into married life. James continued working at the Double Bar Ranch while building up his own small herd of cattle on his land. Eleanor kept her homestead, but moved most of her belongings to James's cabin, riding over every few days to check on the property and make sure everything was secure. She also continued her work in town, not because they desperately needed the money, but because she liked having something that was hers, like the independence it gave her. James never questioned her need to work or suggested she should stay home, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could say. He understood that her pride and independence were not things to be overcome but essential parts of who she was, and he loved her for them rather than in spite of them. In February, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, recognizing the signs from women she had known, but she had not said anything to James, afraid to get both their hopes up in case she was wrong. When she finally told him, sitting at their table over breakfast one morning, James's face went through a series of expressions so quickly she almost laughed. Shock, joy, fear, and then fierce protectiveness. "Are you sure?" he asked, reaching across the table to take her hands. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor," Eleanor said. "I have missed my monthly courses twice, and I have been sick in the mornings. I think the baby will come sometime in September." James came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby. Eleanor, I am so happy I can barely think straight." Eleanor held him back just as tightly, allowing herself to feel the joy and excitement she had been keeping tamped down. She was scared too, scared of childbirth and all the things that could go wrong, scared of bringing a child into a world that was harsh and unforgiving. But she was also happy, deeply and genuinely happy in a way that felt like a gift. "I am scared," she admitted. "My mother died giving birth to a stillborn baby when I was 12. I remember how long she labored, how much she suffered. What if something goes wrong?" James pulled back to look at her face, his expression serious. "Nothing is going to go wrong," he said firmly. "We will get the best doctor we can find, and I will be with you every step of the way. You are strong, Eleanor, stronger than anyone I know. You are going to be fine, and our baby is going to be fine." Eleanor wanted to believe him, and mostly she did. But she also knew that women died in childbirth all the time, especially out here where doctors were scarce and medical care was limited. All she could do was take care of herself, eat well, rest when she could, and hope that her body would do what it was meant to do. As winter gave way to spring and then summer, Eleanor's belly grew round and heavy. She had to stop doing laundry, the physical labor too much for her changing body, but she continued with her mending as long as she could, needing the distraction and the small income. James was beside himself with worry and excitement, constantly fussing over her, making sure she was eating enough, insisting she rest even when she felt fine. "You are treating me like I am made of glass," Eleanor complained one evening in late August, when James had just finished lecturing her about not lifting heavy things. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am not going to break." "I know you are not," James said, but his eyes were worried. "I just cannot stand the thought of anything happening to you. You are the most important thing in my life, Eleanor, you and this baby." Eleanor softened, reaching out to touch his face. "Nothing is going to happen to me," she said, echoing his earlier promise to her. "I am strong, remember? You said so yourself." Their son was born on a hot September night after a labor that lasted 14 hours. The doctor from Copper Springs arrived in time to help, a gruff older man named Dr. Morrison, who had delivered hundreds of babies and seen just about everything. Eleanor labored through the night, James holding her hand and wiping her face with a cool cloth, and when their son finally arrived with a strong, lusty cry, Eleanor felt a rush of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. "A boy, Doctor," Morrison announced, placing the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him." Eleanor looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and his shock of dark hair, and felt tears streaming down her face. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, and he was hers. James was crying too, openly and unashamedly, as he touched the baby's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "What should we name him?" James asked, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor had been thinking about this for months. "Thomas," she said. "For my first husband, who was a good man and would have wanted to be a father, and James for you for his middle name. Thomas James Cartwright." James looked at her with such love and gratitude that Eleanor felt her heart might burst. "Thank you," he said simply. "For him, for you, for this life we are building together. I love you so much, Eleanor." "I love you too," Eleanor said, and it was the truest thing she had ever spoken. The first months with baby Thomas were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. He was a hungry baby, demanding to be fed every few hours, and Eleanor felt like she barely slept. But she also felt a contentment she had never known, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with societal expectations, and everything to do with the love she felt for her son and her husband. James was a devoted father, getting up with the baby at night so Eleanor could rest, walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. He continued working at the Double Bar Ranch but came home every evening without fail, eager to see his wife and son. Their small herd was growing slowly, and James talked about the day when he would be able to work his own land full-time, building a ranch that would support their family and could be passed down to Thomas when he was grown. When Thomas was 6 months old, Eleanor decided it was time to sell her original homestead. It was hard to let go of the land she and her first husband had claimed together, the place where she had buried him, but it was also practical. They needed the money to expand James's herd, and there was no point in maintaining 2 properties when they were building their life on this one. She rode over one last time, alone, and stood for a long while by Thomas's grave. "I am happy," she told the simple wooden cross that marked his resting place. "I hope you can understand that wherever you are. I loved you, and I will always be grateful for the time we had together. But I love James too in a different way, and we have a son now. A beautiful, healthy son that I named for you because you deserve to be remembered. I hope you are at peace, Thomas. I finally am." She sold the homestead to a young couple newly arrived from Kansas, full of the same hope and determination she and Thomas had brought west. She used the money to buy 30 head of cattle, which James integrated into their growing herd. It felt like closing one chapter and fully committing to the next, and Eleanor felt lighter for it, as if she had been carrying a weight she had not fully acknowledged. Over the next few years, their ranch prospered. It was hard work, relentless and exhausting, but it was theirs and they were building it together. James hired a few ranch hands to help with the cattle, and Eleanor managed the household and the garden, which had expanded to include a much larger variety of vegetables, and even some fruit trees that James had ordered from California. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, all chubby legs and infectious giggles, exploring everything he could reach and keeping both his parents constantly on their toes. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after James's mother. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin, and from the very beginning she had a personality that suggested she would not be easily managed. James adored her, carrying her everywhere when he was home, singing to her in his rough voice until she fell asleep on his shoulder. "2 children," Eleanor said one evening, watching James play with Margaret while Thomas practiced his letters at the table. "Sometimes I can barely believe this is my life, that I get to have this." James looked up from making faces at the baby and smiled at her. "You deserve this," he said. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Eleanor. You fought for it, survived for it, never gave up even when things seemed impossible. This is not luck or chance. This is what you earned." Eleanor thought about that, about the woman she had been 4 years ago, starving and alone and too proud to ask for help. That woman seemed like a stranger now, though Eleanor knew she was still in there somewhere, that core of steel and determination that had kept her going. But she was also different now, softer in some ways, more open to receiving love and giving it in return. James had taught her that strength did not mean facing everything alone, that vulnerability could be a form of courage, that asking for and accepting help was not the same as being weak. "I am glad you left those supplies at my door," she said. "Even though I was furious about it at the time, even though it went against everything I believed about self-reliance. If you had not done that, I might have been forced to give up the homestead, to leave the territory. We might never have met, or we might have met too late when I was different, when we were both different." "I am glad too," James said. "Though I was terrified you would shoot me if you caught me, you had that look about you like you would rather die than be pitied." "I did feel that way," Eleanor admitted. "Pity was the worst thing I could imagine, worse than hunger, worse than failure. But you never pitied me, did you? You just saw someone who needed help and gave it, no strings attached, no expectations. That made all the difference." James put Margaret in her cradle and came to sit beside Eleanor, taking her hand in his. "I saw someone extraordinary," he said quietly. "Someone who had been dealt a terrible hand and was playing it with more grace and courage than most people could manage. I wanted to help you, yes, but I also wanted to know you, to understand what made you so fierce and so unwilling to bend. And the more I knew you, the more I loved you." They sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of their children settling for sleep, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the wind moving through the cottonwood trees James had planted by the house. It was a peaceful life, a good life, and Eleanor felt grateful for every moment of it. 2 years later, when Eleanor was pregnant with their third child, disaster struck in the form of a drought that seemed determined to destroy everything they had built. The rains that usually came in July and August never materialized, and by September the grass was brown and brittle. The creek that ran through their property had dried to a trickle, and the cattle were growing thin. James and his ranch hands spent long days hauling water from the well, rationing every drop, watching helplessly as their herd began to die despite their best efforts. Eleanor, heavy with pregnancy and exhausted from the heat, did what she could to help. She tended the garden with water saved from cooking and washing, managed to keep a few vegetables alive, and tried to keep the children cool and entertained while James worked himself to exhaustion trying to save the cattle. Money grew tight as they had to buy hay and grain to supplement the failing grazing, and Eleanor began to feel an old, familiar fear creeping in, the fear of not having enough, of losing everything. "We might have to sell some of the herd," James said one evening in late October, his face drawn and worried. "Just to have enough money to keep the rest alive through the winter if this drought does not break." Eleanor looked at her husband, at the lines of stress around his eyes and mouth, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in her. They had worked so hard for what they had built this life from nothing, and she would be damned if she let a drought take it away without a fight. "We still have the money from selling my homestead," she said. "Not all of it, but some. We could use that to buy feed, hold on a little longer." James shook his head. "That is your money, Eleanor. You earned it from land that was yours. I will not take it to cover my losses." "Our losses," Eleanor corrected firmly. "This is our ranch, our life, our family. There is no yours and mine anymore, James. We are in this together, remember? That is what you promised me, that we would face the hard times together." James looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "Together," he agreed. "Always together." They used the money to buy hay and grain, and they rationed what they had with careful precision. James worked longer hours than ever, and Eleanor did too despite her pregnancy, both of them driven by the determination not to lose what they had fought so hard to build. The children sensed the tension and were quieter than usual, Thomas trying to be helpful in his 5-year-old way and Margaret sticking close to her mother's side. In November, just when it seemed things could not get worse, the rains finally came. They started as a drizzle and then built to a steady downpour that lasted for 3 days, soaking into the parched earth and filling the creek again. The grass would need time to recover, but the immediate crisis was over. They had lost 15 head of cattle, a significant blow but not a catastrophic one, and the herd that remained would survive. Eleanor went into labor during the rainstorm, and their third child, another son they named David, was born to the sound of water drumming on the roof. He was smaller than his siblings had been, but healthy and strong, and as Eleanor held him and listened to the life-giving rain, she felt like it was a sign that they had weathered the worst and would survive. And they did survive, not just survive but thrive. The drought had been a setback, but it had also taught them valuable lessons about preparation and resilience. Over the next few years, James invested in a windmill that could pump water more efficiently, and he built a large storage tank for emergencies. Eleanor expanded her garden even more and learned how to preserve food in every way possible, canning and drying and salting against future hard times. Their family continued to grow. 2 years after David came another daughter, Sarah, and then 2 years after that, their youngest, a boy named Jacob. 5 children in total, and their small cabin was bursting at the seams. James and his ranch hands built an addition, expanding the house to accommodate their growing family, adding a proper dining room and more bedrooms, and even a small study where Eleanor could keep her accounts and Thomas could do his schoolwork. The ranch grew too. James bought more land, expanded the herd, and hired more help. He developed a reputation as a fair employer and a shrewd rancher, and other cattlemen sought his advice. Eleanor managed the household with the same fierce competence she had brought to keeping herself alive alone, and she also began teaching the local children who lived too far from town to attend school regularly. She held classes in their dining room 3 days a week, teaching reading and writing and arithmetic to a dozen children ranging in age from 5 to 14. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and animals equally, who could gentle a wild horse with patience and read Shakespeare with understanding. Margaret was all fire and determination, constantly getting into scrapes and adventures, riding before she could walk properly and announcing at age 7 that she was going to be a rancher like her father. David was the peacemaker, sensitive and intuitive, always aware of other people's feelings and trying to smooth over conflicts. Sarah was the artist, always drawing or painting or making something beautiful out of nothing. And Jacob, the baby, was pure joy, laughing at everything and charming everyone he met. Eleanor watched her children grow and felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with typical measures of success. She had created life, nurtured it, taught her children to be strong and kind and capable. She had built a home that was filled with love and laughter, even in the hard times. She had partnered with a man who respected her and loved her and never tried to make her smaller than she was. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James gave Eleanor a gift, a complete set of books, 40 volumes including novels and poetry and history and philosophy, that he had ordered from a bookstore in San Francisco. It must have cost him a small fortune, and Eleanor cried when she saw them, carefully packed in straw and arranged in the new bookshelf James had built to hold them. "You said you missed reading more than almost anything," James said, watching her run her hands over the leather bindings with reverence. "I wanted you to have that back, to have something that is just for you, not for the children or the ranch or anyone else." Eleanor threw her arms around him, books forgotten for the moment. "Have I told you lately that I love you?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Not since this morning," James said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, "but I never get tired of hearing it." "I love you," Eleanor said, pulling back to look at him. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. You see me, really see me, and you love me anyway. Do you know what a gift that is?" "The gift is you," James said seriously. "The gift is getting to spend my life with you, building something meaningful, raising these amazing children, facing whatever comes next together. I would not trade one moment of the last 10 years, not the good times or the hard times, because they were all with you." They made love that night with the tenderness and passion of long familiarity, knowing each other's bodies as well as they knew their own, understanding without words what the other needed. Afterward, Eleanor lay in James's arms and thought about the strange path her life had taken, how different it was from what she had imagined as a young woman in Missouri. She had thought she would marry Thomas and have a comfortable, predictable life. She had not anticipated becoming a widow at 23, alone in the Arizona territory with nothing but her pride and her determination. She had not anticipated nearly starving, or finding mysterious supplies on her doorstep, or falling in love with a cowboy who saw her strength and did not try to diminish it. She had not anticipated building a ranch, raising 5 children, teaching school, surviving drought and hardship and loss. But she would not change any of it, not one moment, because it had all led her here, to this man and this life and this profound sense of belonging. She had learned that pride could be both a strength and a weakness, that accepting help was not the same as being helpless, that love could come when you least expected it, and in forms you never imagined. She had learned that she was stronger than she knew, more resilient, more capable of adapting and surviving and thriving. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, his voice drowsy. "About how lucky I am," Eleanor said. "About how grateful I am for everything, even the hard parts, because they made me who I am." "We are both lucky," James said, tightening his arms around her. "We found each other when we needed each other most, and we built something beautiful out of difficult circumstances." "That is not luck, really. That is choice. We chose each other, we chose this life, we chose to keep fighting even when things got hard." "Choice," Eleanor repeated, liking the word. She had made so many choices in her life, some good and some bad, but the choice to accept James's help and later to accept his love had been the best ones. They had changed everything, opened up possibilities she had not known existed, given her a life rich with meaning and connection. As the years passed, Eleanor and James watched their children grow into adults with their own dreams and ambitions. Thomas went east to attend university, the first in either of their families to do so, and came back with a degree in veterinary medicine, and a wife from Boston who took one look at the Arizona territory and fell in love with it. Margaret married one of their ranch hands, a quiet man named Samuel, who was one of the few people who could keep up with her energy, and they started their own ranch on land James helped them buy. David became a teacher, taking over Eleanor's informal school and eventually building a proper schoolhouse in Copper Springs. Sarah went to San Francisco to study art and sent home paintings that captured the beauty of the desert in ways that made Eleanor's heart ache. Jacob, the youngest, stayed on the ranch with his parents, learning the business from James and promising to keep it going when his father was too old to work. Eleanor and James grew older together, their dark hair turning gray, their faces weathering with time and sun. But they still held hands when they walked, still looked at each other with love and desire, still made each other laugh with old jokes and new observations. Their ranch was prosperous, their children were happy and successful, and their grandchildren were beginning to appear, adding another generation to the family they had built. On a warm evening in September, 30 years after they had first married, Eleanor and James sat on the porch of their expanded house and watched the sun set over the mountains. Thomas and Margaret and their families were visiting, and the house was full of noise and life, grandchildren running everywhere, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting through the open windows. "Do you remember the first time I left supplies at your door?" James asked, his hand warm in Eleanor's. "Of course I remember," Eleanor said. "I was furious and grateful in equal measure. I did not know whether to thank you or shoot you." James laughed. "I was terrified you would catch me and tell me to take them back. You had such pride, such determination not to need anyone." "I still have pride," Eleanor said. "But I have learned that needing people is not weakness, it is human. And letting people help you, really help you without resentment or obligation, is a gift you give them as much as yourself." "You have given me so many gifts," James said seriously. "Your love, your partnership, our children, this life. I never imagined I would have all this when I was a cowboy working for wages and dreaming of my own small piece of land. You made it all possible, Eleanor. You and your strength and your courage." "We made it possible," Eleanor corrected. "Together. You saw me when I was at my lowest, when I had nothing left but my pride, and instead of pitying me or trying to diminish me, you found a way to help that let me keep my dignity. That is why I fell in love with you, James. Because you understood that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is accept help when you need it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple, listening to the sounds of their family inside. Eleanor thought about that woman she had been 30 years ago, alone and starving and too proud to ask for help, and she felt a deep compassion for her. That woman had been doing the best she could with what she had, fighting to survive in a world that was not kind to women alone. She had deserved help, had deserved compassion, had deserved someone like James who saw her struggle and did not turn away. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. "For seeing me, for helping me, for loving me." "Always," James said and kissed her hand. "For as long as we both shall live, and probably beyond that too, you are the love of my life, Eleanor Cartwright, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Their youngest grandson came running out onto the porch then, demanding that Grandpa come see the new foal in the barn, and James allowed himself to be dragged away with a smile and a wink at Eleanor. She watched them go, her heart full to bursting, and thought about all the years that had brought them to this moment. The hard years and the good years, the struggles and the triumphs, the losses and the gains. She had refused to beg for help, and a cowboy had seen her pride and quietly left supplies at her door. That simple act of kindness had changed everything, had saved her life in more ways than one, had led to love and partnership, and a family and a legacy that would outlive them both. It had taught her that accepting help was not weakness, that vulnerability was a form of strength, that love could find you even in the darkest times if you were willing to open your heart to it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. She had lived a full life, a rich life, a life filled with love and meaning and purpose. She had faced hardship and survived, had found love when she thought she would spend the rest of her days alone, had built something lasting and beautiful with a man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. The future stretched out before them, full of grandchildren and great-grandchildren to come, full of continued partnership and love and the quiet joy of growing old together. They would face whatever came with the same determination and courage that had brought them this far, holding hands and supporting each other. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built a life worth living. Years later, when Eleanor was 72 and James was 74, they celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The ranch was now run primarily by Jacob and his sons, but James still went out every day to check on the cattle, and Eleanor still tended her garden and taught reading to any child who wanted to learn. They moved a little slower now, their joints stiff with arthritis, their hearing not what it once was, but their love for each other had only deepened with time. On the night of their anniversary, after all the family had gone home or to bed, Eleanor and James sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead, and Eleanor leaned against James's shoulder with a sigh of contentment. 42 years, she said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we got married, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I know what you mean, James said, his arm around her shoulders. I cannot really remember what my life was like before you, even though I know I had one. You are so much a part of me now that I cannot imagine existing without you. We are lucky, Eleanor said, to have found each other, to have had all these years together. Not everyone gets that. We make our own luck, James said, echoing words he had said to her many times over the years. We chose each other, chose to build this life, chose to keep loving each other even when times were hard. That is not luck. That is commitment and work and choosing each other every single day. Eleanor smiled, knowing he was right. Love was not just a feeling, though feelings were certainly part of it. Love was a choice, made over and over again, through good times and bad, through hardship and joy, through all the ordinary moments that made up a life. She and James had chosen each other 42 years ago, and they had continued choosing each other every day since. I love you, she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. I will love you until my last breath and probably beyond that too. I love you too, James said and kissed the top of her head. More than words can say, more than actions can show, you are my heart, Eleanor, you always have been. They sat together under the stars, two people who had weathered everything life had thrown at them and emerged stronger for it. Two people who had built a legacy of love and family and hard work that would endure long after they were gone. And as Eleanor drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, safe and warm and loved, she thought that this was what happiness looked like. Not an absence of hardship, but the presence of love that endured through everything. Eleanor lived to be 87 years old, and James followed her just 6 months later, unable or unwilling to continue without his beloved wife by his side. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under cottonwood trees that James had planted 50 years earlier. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to mourn them and celebrate them, sharing stories of their strength and their love and the example they had set for all who came after. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, and the name Cartwright became synonymous with integrity and hard work in the Arizona territory. But more than the land or the cattle or the material success, Eleanor and James's true legacy was the love they had shared and the family they had created, a testament to the power of compassion and courage and choosing each other every single day. And somewhere on a dusty shelf in the ranch house, carefully preserved, was a worn burlap sack that had once held salt pork and cornmeal and dried beans, the first gift that a cowboy had given to a proud widow who refused to beg for help. It was a reminder of how everything had started, of a simple act of kindness that had changed two lives and created something beautiful and lasting. In the end, that was what mattered, not the pride that kept Eleanor from asking for help, but the compassion that moved James to give it anyway. Not the hardship they faced, but the love that sustained them through it. Not the individual achievements, but the partnership that made everything possible. They had found each other when they needed each other most, and they had built a life worth living, filled with love and purpose and meaning. Their story became legend in the territory, told and retold by those who remembered them. A tale of pride and compassion, of struggle and triumph, of two people who found love in the harsh landscape of the Wild West and nurtured it into something that would outlast them both. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with two elderly people sitting on a porch under the stars, holding hands and watching the sun set over the mountains, still choosing each other after all those years, still in love, still together. That was the true happy ending. Not a single moment of triumph, but a lifetime of moments, strung together like pearls on a string, each one precious and meaningful because they were shared. Eleanor and James had lived fully and loved deeply, and they had left behind a legacy that would continue for generations. A reminder that the best things in life come not from pride or independence, but from the courage to accept help when you need it and the wisdom to give it when you can. And so their story ended as all good love stories should, with a life well lived, a love well nurtured, and a family well raised, carrying forward the values and the lessons and the love that Eleanor and James had embodied every day of their long, rich lives together.